The Cuban Missile Crisis was the climax of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. It took place for 13 days, October 16th to October 28th, 1962, on the island of Cuba, just 103 miles away from the coast of Florida. During World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union had become allies to defeat Adolf Hitler and the Nazis after Germany broke the Non-Aggression Pact and attacked the Soviet Union. After World War II, however, the United States and Soviet Union disagreed on what was to happen to Europe, specifically Germany. This was the start of the Cold War, a time period of tension between the United States and the Soviet Union in which there was no direct confrontation, only conflicts through third parties. The Cold War lasted from 1945 to 1991. The allies of World War II, the United States, the Soviet Union, France, and England, decided to split Germany into 4 occupational zones. France, England, and the United States merged their zones together to create the Democratic Federal Republic of Germany, also known as West Germany. Joseph Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union from April 3, 1922 to his death on March 5, 1953, saw this action as a direct threat to his country and communism, so he attempted to force the United States to abandon their support for West Germany. Stalin set a blockade of Berlin, which was divided between the United States and the Soviet Union, but it was unsuccessful after the Berlin airlift, where U.S. President Harry S. Truman had thousands of supplies dropped by aircraft into West Berlin to help the people trapped in the blockade. Stalin had to be willing to shoot the aircraft down, but he was not, because neither he nor the United States wanted to start another war, so he was forced to free West Berlin. 1950 was the year of tragedy in fighting the Cold War. China and North Korea both fell to the Communists, and the Soviet Union announced that it had acquired the atomic bomb, which meant that the United States was no longer the only nuclear power. The United States also began noticing increased spread of communism, even within its own borders. Here is Stanley Jaroszewski to tell us about where he was aware of communism during this time.
I just never had that feeling that I've never met anyone that I thought would be, so I just didn't think they would be around.
In 1953, after Stalin's death, arose a new leader in the Soviet Union by the name of Nikita Khrushchev. He was the communist leader of the Soviet Union from 1953 to 1964. Khrushchev and the Soviet Union were admired by Fidel Castro, who led a revolution to overthrow Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista. Castro wanted the United States to stop supporting Batista. In order to become leader of Cuba, Castro promised the public that he would create democracy, but he lied. Castro was a communist who wanted the support of the Soviet Union to get money to fund his Cuban revolution. This was the first time communism had officially taken over a country in the Western Hemisphere, and Americans were becoming more aware of the increasing communist population.
Only in Cuba, but not too much in the United States, but because Fidel Castro he leaned that way. And he made friends with Khrushchev, and that's how they got involved with the missiles and so forth.
The United States and Cuba did not get along very well ever since the United States military forced Spain to surrender Cuba. Even though Cuba was then inaugurated as an independent nation, President McKinley allowed for U.S. intervention in Cuban affairs as stated in 1901 by the Platt Amendment, which held valid legislation until 1934. Cuba was prepared for a revolution after having various dictators, and in 1959, Fidel Castro began leading the revolution. After Castro announced that he was a communist, the American Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, felt betrayed by Castro and wanted to take him out. As told by Stanley Jaroszewski, the American public did not view Fidel Castro in a positive way as he rose to power in Cuba.
He wasn't well liked up until his death, which was almost 57, 58 years later, because he took over in 59. Yeah, he wasn't well accepted in America.
Fidel Castro requested economic aid from the United States, but the U.S. rejected and broke off Cuban diplomatic relations. So, Castro met with the Soviet Foreign Minister Anastas Mikoyan to secure a $100 million loan from the Soviet Union. It was then that U.S. policymakers believed Castro should be overthrown for having too close of a relationship with the Soviet Union. In the spring of 1960, President Dwight D. Eisenhower approved an operation created by the CIA to send in U.S.-trained exiles to work in Cuban underground as insurgents to overthrow Castro. Insurgents are people who rise in forcible opposition to lawful authority. When President John F. Kennedy was elected into office, however, the operation had not gone into effect yet. Kennedy was reluctant in continuing with the invasion because he didn't want the Soviet Union to get involved and start World War III. However, the CIA insisted that the plan would work, so Kennedy signed off on it because his administration wanted to overthrow Castro to lower the threat of communism as a location so close to the United States. The CIA had assumed that the Cubans would rally behind the invasion force, and they had underestimated the effectiveness of Castro's forces. The Bay of Pigs invasion began on April 17, 1961, when U.S. forces transported 1,500 Cuban dissidents to Cuba. Dissidents are people who speak out against or disagree with the controlling regime. Between 2:30 and 3 o'clock a.m., exiles armed with U.S. weapons came ashore at Playa Girón and Playa Largas. Cuban forces quickly reacted, and Castro sent his air force to halt the invaders. The Cuban aircraft sank at a U.S. command and control ship and a supply vessel with exiles on board. Cuban T-33 jets shot down 10 out of the 12 slow-moving B-26 bombers that were helping the invaders. Kennedy, following Secretary of State Dean Rusk's recommendation, did not provide the invasion with official U.S. air support. Invaders were heavily attacked by Cuban artillery and tank fire. Within 72 hours, the invading force had been pushed all the way back to their landing area at Playa Girón, surrounded by Castro's forces. 114 exiles died in the invasion, and the remainder were either taken captive or they managed to escape into the countryside. 1,189 captures were sentenced to prison following a televised trial in Cuba. José Miro Cardona, the Cuban exile leader and president of the U.S.-backed National Recovery Council, blamed the failed invasion on the CIA and Kennedy's refusal to authorize air support. This invasion greatly increased U.S. and Soviet tensions. Khrushchev and Kennedy exchanged messages during the invasion, where Khrushchev accused the United States of being complicit in the invasion and warned that the Soviet Union would help defend Cuba if necessary. Kennedy had replied with an equally strong warning against Soviet activity in Cuba. This tension set the stage for increased Soviet military aid to Cuba, ultimately leading to the Cuban Missile Crisis in October. In early 1962, Khrushchev set a quiet operation to deploy ballistic missiles, medium-range bombers, and a regiment of mechanized infantry to Cuba in a plan known as Andander. Stanley Jaroszewski was a member of the United States Navy during this time. He states that he joined the Navy for 2 reasons.
Well, first off, I wanted to defend our country. I was young. I was just out of high school. I had no job training, so I joined the service and helped they would get me prepared for a life when I got out of the service.
Prior to 1962, Soviet submarine presence in the Atlantic was minimal, and nuclear submarines were rarely ever deployed, but the order of Ushakov Submarine Squadron changed that. The squadron consisted of the 69th Submarine Project of 4 Project 641 long-range diesel attack submarines and 7-boat 18th Submarine Division of Project 629 diesel-powered ballistic missile subs, called the Golf class. Each missile boat carried 3 R-13 D-2 ballistic missiles, which could be fired in intervals of 4 minutes only when the sub was on the surface. On September 30th, 4 of the subs departed from Seda Bay's old fishing piers. The silent move to this location was because the landing of the special torpedoes was to be done in total secrecy. This crisis was broadcasted all over America during this time, according to Stanley Jaroszewski.
Very positive and very active. They publicized just about everything that the government was doing, and the government was also letting us know what they were doing.
On the evening of Monday, October 22nd, President Kennedy spoke at the White House regarding Soviet activity in Cuba.
Acting therefore in the defense of our own security and of the entire Western Hemisphere, and under the authority entrusted to me by the Constitution, as endorsed by the resolution of the Congress, I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. This quarantine will be extended, if needed, to other types of cargo and carriers. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace.
This news broadcasted to the public worried Americans, and Stanley remembers the American response to the missile deployment in Cuba.
I would say they were very anxious and concerned about missiles, no matter who was putting them there, so close to our country.
In order to initiate this blockade, the United States created the Anti-Submarine Warfare Force, also known as the ASW, which consisted of Destroyer Squadron 24 Newport-based destroyers, the USS Blandy, Kepler, Charles S. Sperry, and aircraft carrier USS Essex. These ships were to patrol the Ark outside of a barrier called the Walnut Line, which was the line of the operation given the arc northeast of Cuba, defining the outer limits of the quarantine, spreading an arc 500 miles around Cuba. This was the line where Soviet ships approaching Cuba would first encounter U.S. force blockade. Stanley Jaroszewski states that the American Navy wasn't ever concerned about a Soviet encounter during this time until the blockade.
We just thought it was, it's been going on for so long and nobody was no threat to anything, except this one incident with the missile crisis.
The best methods to detect a submarine is by first passively listening, then transmitting a sound pulse through water and timing the echo's return, because the primary advantage of the submarine is the ability to hide at various depths in the sea. The Blandy was a Forrest Sherman-class destroyer named in honor of Admiral William H.P. Blandy, chief of the Bureau of Ordnance in the early 1940s and the commander of Amphibious Group 1 during the island-hopping campaign in the Pacific. Aboard the Blandy were 23 officers, 19 chief petty officers, and 350 crewmen. Stanley Jaroszewski was in close contact with a Russian that was not a member of the Soviet Union.
We had one sailor on our ship. He was of Russian nationality.
The Russian speaker's name was Dubicki. He was a Czech-born engineer from the repair division who was incredibly helpful when Blandy began stopping ships to confirm and count their missile cargoes. The commanding officer of the destroyer was Edward G. Kelly. He was a New Englander from Massachusetts Maritime Academy who served during World War II. Kelly had a reputation of one of the most gifted officers in anti-submarine warfare in the Atlantic Fleet. Here is Stanley Jaroszewski to tell us more about life aboard the Blandy.
It was called the destroyer, and it was called the USS Blandy. My job was what they would call a signalman. A signalman is considered a radio man who was learning Morse code by eye. I would communicate by the flashing light on the ship, and not by ears. There wasn't actually training. We got underway, we went the ship early in the morning, not knowing why or where we were going until we actually got into the Caribbean. And then that's when they got the orders, and our job was to stop the merchants from taking the missiles into Cuba.
It is assured that Americans were worried about the missiles in Cuba because the weapons were incredibly close to the country. Men all over the country wanted to serve the United States during this time, leaving their families to go off in Cuban waters. Stanley was allowed access to communication with his family, and he shares what it was like and how his relationship was with them while on the ship.
I would assume they were concerned. They didn't let me know, and we didn't know what kind of danger we were actually in. We just thought we were going to go there and escort the merchants back into the Atlantic Ocean and send them back to Russia. We communicated back then, and it was in the 60s, we had what they call a ham operator. And that was a person who had a capability with the radio technology of transferring your messages to him, and then he would transfer it to whoever you were talking to, and they would communicate back with him, and he would throw it, what they would call throw a switch. When you got done a sentence, you would have to say over so they would know you were done. But I've communicated with people like that, and most of them were, I would say, located in New Jersey, and they were mostly in vehicles, driving. So mostly talked to my wife and my mother and my brother. And the content was just, I'm fine, I'm okay, everything's all right.
The American Navy initially had no idea how many Soviet submarines may be escorting merchant ships. They were also uninformed that Captain Gennady Agafonov's force of the 4 Foxtrot-class submarines from Polyarny were already among the U.S. naval cordon. Captain Agafonov was the commander to the 69th Brigade, who was aboard the Foxtrot B-4 submarine. Polyarny is located on the outermost western side of the Kola Bay, approximately 1,900 kilometers north of Moscow. When the Navy did discover that there were missile-armed submarines in the waters below them, it was terrifying. Stanley Jaroszewski speaks of how he felt his life was threatened during his time on the Blandy.
When we first went out into the Cuban waters, it was to stop these missiles from arriving in Cuba, and then through further investigation and intelligence, we found out there was Russian submarines out there in the water. Now, that was our concern as far as how far now are we going to go with these submarines and us. And with luck, everything was peaceful. We managed to surface a submarine. Like I say, it was the Russians, when we found out it was the Russian submarine. First, it was a little weary when we saw the missiles that were going over there because they were covered under, so nobody could surveil them. But we made them uncover them, and you could see they were humongous. They were and scary, knowing that there was a possible missiles only a couple hundred miles from America, and that scared us. But then when we found out it was Russian submarines were in the water, we didn't know what the outcome was going to be.
The United States naval blockade went into effect at 10 o'clock a.m. on October 24th. Agafonov's submarines were in the midst of a growing number of U.S. ships, patrolling their small assigned areas. They had no knowledge of the deployment of ASW hunter-killer ships. Admiral Georgievich Gorchkov, admiral of the fleet of the Soviet Union Sergei, ordered that the submarines were to only receive routine traffic on the broadcast from the Soviet Union. He was dead set against sending extraneous material on the schedules because he believed the traffic analysis would give away the operation. Admiral Leonid Rybalko could not allow his men in the 4 submarines to continue to operate without any knowledge, thousands of miles away, right next to the United States. Their lives and the mission were both in danger, and to let them continue without intervening was against everything he had ever believed in more than 30 years in uniform. Rybalko had a secret message sent to the submarines against Gorshkov's orders. On October 26th, Kennedy received a message from Khrushchev, who proposed that his government would withdraw the offensive missiles and destroy their launch sites in Cuba if the United States would lift the blockade and promise not to invade Cuba. This message was not made to the public for some time. On October 27th, Blandy found one of the Soviet submarines, Foxtrot-class sub B-59. Savitsky, the commander of the sub, was maneuvering at 60 to 100 meters and had no isothermal layer to hide beneath. The destroyer dropped sound grenades in series of 5, signaling for the submarine to surface. The first contact with the sub was at 10 o'clock in the morning, and after nearly a day of the simulated grenade attacks, Captain Vasily Savitsky was forced to surface to charge batteries of his submarine. He surfaced slowly and carefully, wary of the American destroyer. The Soviets felt defeated that one of their subs was forced to surface by the United States, and Chief of Staff Vasily Arkhipov was not pleased with Savitsky, even though there was little he could do. They had been heavily outnumbered by ships and aircraft. On October 31st, the USS Charles P. Cecil surfaced another submarine at 5:53 a.m., Alexei Dubivko's Foxtrot B-36. The first submarine, Commander Shunkov's B-39, was forced to surface after it ran out of power and could no longer stay underwater. The submarine commanders had always thought that the Americans were preparing for war and that they would attack the subs, but they sent light flashing signals asking, "Do you need assistance?" The Soviets were surprised by the friendly behavior of the Americans, watching them celebrate surfacing the submarines on deck. The submarines were escorted back to Polyarny by the American destroyer ships. The fourth submarine was never surfaced by the United States. Agafonov ordered Captain Ryurik Kitov of submarine B-4 to surface and return to Polyarny after the other 3 Foxtrot submarines were found and surfaced. After Blandy returned to Newport, Rhode Island, after assisting and escorting the submarines back to Polyarny in December, the destroyer received the Marjorie Sterrett Navy League Trophy for excellence in anti-submarine warfare. The Cuban Missile Crisis officially came to an end on October 28, 1962, days before the last of the Foxtrot submarines were surfaced. Kennedy and Khrushchev agreed to put an end to the crisis with an agreement. Khrushchev decided to withdraw its nuclear arsenal from Cuba if the United States publicly declared that it would not attack Cuba and it would privately withdraw its own nuclear arsenal from Turkey. Fidel Castro was not aware of these negotiations, which represented how minor of a role Cuba played in the Soviet Union. The repercussions of the Cuban Missile Crisis were considerable, concerning the fact that the world had come closer to nuclear war than ever before. For the remainder of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union were both much more aware and cautious of nuclear arms deployment.